Officer Davis's first words dripped with suspicion, his tone carrying an edge that didn't match the peaceful evening around them. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he demanded, skipping the usual professional greeting that every officer was trained to give. His flashlight beam continued to shine directly into Michelle's eyes, even though the street lights and her car's interior light made it completely unnecessary. Michelle felt her heart rate pick up slightly, not from fear, but from disappointment. She'd seen this scene play out before from the other side of the badge, watching dash cam footage during training sessions, using these moments to teach new officers what not to do. Now here she was, living it firsthand. "I live here," she replied calmly, maintaining her composed demeanor. She could feel the weight of her badge and her purse on the passenger seat, but something told her to wait. This was a moment that needed to unfold naturally. Officer Davis let out a short, dismissive laugh that made Michelle's stomach tighten. "Right. And I suppose that's your car too." His flashlight beam swept across the leather seats of her sit-in, lingering on the designer handbag on the passenger seat. The implication in his voice was clear as day. "Yes, it is my car," Michelle responded, her voice remaining steady despite the growing tension. She taught countless officers about the importance of giving every citizen basic respect, yet here she was, being treated like a suspicious character in her own neighborhood. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your license, registration, and proof of insurance." His tone suggested he was expecting to find something wrong, something to justify his suspicions. "And keep your hands where I can see them while you reach for them." Michelle noticed he still hadn't mentioned why he pulled her over. Another violation of basic protocol. She'd written that protocol herself 3 years ago, making sure every officer knew they needed to state the reason for a traffic stop right at the beginning. "Officer Davis," she said, reading his nameplate again to make it clear she was paying attention to details, "could you first tell me why you pulled me over?" She kept her tone professional but firm, the same way she spoke during department meetings. His response came with a slight sneer. "You made some suspicious turns back there. Looked like you might be casing houses." The lie was so blatant it would have been almost funny if it wasn't so concerning. Michelle had driven straight home on her usual route, making only 2 normal turns on residential streets. As she reached slowly for her purse, she noticed his hand drift toward his holster. Another unconscious gesture of bias she pointed out in dozens of training sessions. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Here she was, experiencing every example of poor policing she'd ever warned about, performed by an officer who had no idea he was directing his prejudice at a police captain. "I'm going to reach into my purse now," she announced clearly, following the proper procedure she'd taught others. "Inside, you'll find my identification." She purposefully didn't mention her badge yet. The teaching moment wasn't quite ready for that revelation. As she carefully opened her designer handbag, she could feel Officer Davis's eyes boring into her, watching for any sudden movements. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The whole scene felt surreal. Here she was, a respected police captain with 15 years of service, being treated like a criminal in her own neighborhood. She knew what would happen next would change more than just this one officer's evening. This encounter would become a powerful lesson about assumptions, about treating every citizen with respect, about the deep-rooted biases that still plagued law enforcement. But first, she had to let this scene play out just a little longer. Let Officer Davis dig his hole just a bit deeper, before she showed him exactly who he was dealing with. The evening sun was setting over the quiet suburban streets as Police Captain Michelle Chen drove home from a particularly productive community meeting. She had spent hours discussing new neighborhood watch programs and building bridges between law enforcement and local residents. After 15 years on the force, these meetings had become one of her favorite parts of the job, though most people at the meetings never guessed she was one of the department's highest-ranking officers. Driving her personal car, a well-maintained but modest sit-in, she noticed the reflection of headlights that had been following her for the past few blocks. At first, she didn't think much of it. This was a common route home, after all. But as she turned onto Maple Avenue, where beautiful historic homes lined both sides of the street, the patrol car behind her suddenly lit up like a Christmas tree, its red and blue lights cutting through the growing darkness. Michelle took a deep breath, already knowing what this was about. She'd been here before, not as an officer, but as just another black woman driving through an upscale neighborhood. Even after all these years, even after rising through the ranks, these moments still came, still stung. She carefully pulled over to the curb, positioning her car perfectly as she taught countless rookies to do during traffic stops. Following years of ingrained procedure, she turned off the engine, rolled down her window, and placed both hands clearly visible on the steering wheel. The interior light was on, and she waited patiently, watching in her side mirror as the officer took his time getting out of his patrol car. She could tell by his deliberate movements that he was putting on a show of authority. In her rearview mirror, she observed his approach, the swagger in his walk, the hand resting near his holster, the flashlight beam that swept across her car's back seat before finding her face. Michelle recognized the body language instantly. She'd trained enough officers to know when someone was approaching a situation with preconceptions. The beam of light lingered on her face longer than necessary, then swept across the clean interior of her car, pausing on the leather briefcase in the passenger seat and the dry cleaning hanging in the back. She could feel the officer's suspicious energy before he even reached her window. It was familiar, not because she was used to being stopped, but because she'd spent years teaching officers how to approach vehicles professionally and respectfully, without bias or presumption. The approaching footsteps slowed, and Michelle prepared herself for what was coming. She wasn't angry. Not yet. Instead, she felt a deep weariness mixed with determination. This moment, however uncomfortable, could become something meaningful. Whether this young officer realized it or not, he was about to learn one of the most important lessons of his career. She watched as Officer Davis, she could now read his nameplate, positioned himself slightly behind her window, his stance wide and assertive. His flashlight beam remained trained on her face, despite the street being well lit and her interior light already on. It was a subtle form of intimidation, one she corrected countless times during training sessions. "Good evening," she said calmly, before he could speak, her voice steady and clear. She kept her hands visible on the wheel, knowing what would come next. The script was familiar, though she usually witnessed it from a very different perspective. Tonight, she was on the other side of the flashlight beam, and the irony wasn't lost on her. As Officer Davis opened his mouth to speak, Michelle could already tell this would be a story she'd be sharing at future training sessions. A first-hand account of why assumptions and prejudice had no place in modern policing. Sometimes the best lessons came from unexpected places, and this evening was about to become a teaching moment none of them would soon forget. The tension grew thicker as Michelle slowly reached into her purse. She could hear Officer Davis shifting his weight behind her, his hand still hovering near his weapon. The whole situation felt like a training scenario she'd run dozens of times, except this was painfully real. "I don't suppose you have a good explanation for why you're driving such an expensive car in this neighborhood?" Officer Davis pressed, his words carrying an unmistakable accusation. The comment made Michelle pause for just a moment, her hand still in her purse. She'd heard stories like this from community members during meetings, but experiencing it firsthand made her blood boil. Still, she kept her composure. "Actually, I do," she replied evenly. "I live 3 houses down from here. I'm coming home from a community meeting." She watched in the mirror as Officer Davis's face twisted into a skeptical smirk. She knew that look. She'd seen it before in officers who'd let their prejudices cloud their judgment. A community meeting? His tone was mockingly incredulous. And what kind of community meeting would that be? He leaned closer to the window, his flashlight beam still unnecessarily bright in her face. The disbelief in his voice was clear as day. Michelle took a slow, steady breath. It was a police community relations meeting, actually. She could have ended this situation immediately by showing her badge, but something told her to let this play out. Every second of this interaction would become valuable teaching material later. Officer Davis let out a short, dismissive laugh. Right. And I suppose you were leading it? The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. He had no idea how close to the truth he was, and yet so far from understanding the reality of the situation. Sir, Michelle said, her voice taking on the tone she used when addressing problematic officers in her precinct. I've answered your questions politely. I've told you I live here. I'm reaching for my identification as requested, but I'd like to know specifically what traffic violation you observed. The officer's demeanor shifted slightly, caught off guard by her professional tone and direct question. She could see him struggling to maintain his authority. Ma'am, your driving pattern was suspicious, and this is a high-end neighborhood. We have to be vigilant about. About what exactly? Michelle interrupted, her voice calm but firm. About residents driving home, or about something else? She let the question hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Officer Davis straightened up, clearly not used to being challenged. Listen here, if you're going to give me attitude. He started, but Michelle had heard enough. It was time to change the dynamic of this encounter. Officer Davis, she said, her voice taking on the unmistakable authority of a senior officer. I'm going to show you my identification now, and I want you to pay very close attention to what you see. She slowly pulled out her wallet, making sure to keep her movements deliberate and visible. The atmosphere was electric with tension as she opened her wallet. She could see Officer Davis's reflection in her side mirror, his face a mixture of annoyance and unearned superiority. In just a few seconds, that expression would change dramatically. She held her driver's license in one hand, and with the other, she reached back into her purse for her badge. This moment would be more than just a revelation. It would be a lesson this officer would never forget. Sometimes the most powerful teaching moments came from experiencing your own prejudices firsthand. The streetlight caught the gold of her badge as she began to pull it out, and she could already see Officer Davis's posture changing as realization started to dawn. This wasn't just going to be a traffic stop anymore. This was about to become a turning point in this young officer's career, a moment that would reshape his understanding of what it meant to wear the badge and serve the community. The gold badge caught the streetlight and seemed to glow as Michelle held it up alongside her driver's license. For a moment, everything went completely silent. Even the usual evening sounds, crickets, distant traffic, the hum of streetlights, seemed to fade away as Officer Davis processed what he was seeing. His face went through a remarkable transformation. First came confusion, his eyebrows knitting together as he tried to make sense of the badge. Then his eyes widened with recognition, and finally the color drained from his face as he realized exactly who he had been harassing. I'm sorry, Captain, he stammered, immediately dropping the flashlight beam from her face. His hand, which had been resting near his holster, fell limply to his side. I didn't realize. Clearly, Michelle replied, her voice carrying the weight of authority she usually reserved for the most serious department meetings. And that's exactly the problem, isn't it, Officer Davis? She turned in her seat now, facing him directly for the first time. You didn't realize a lot of things tonight. Officer Davis swallowed hard, his previous confidence evaporating like morning dew under a hot sun. Captain, I was just following protocol for suspicious. His voice trailed off as he realized how weak his excuse sounded. Protocol. Michelle's voice was calm, but carried an edge that made the young officer flinch. Let's talk about protocol, Officer Davis. What's the first thing you're supposed to do when approaching a vehicle during a traffic stop? Identify myself and state the reason for the stop. He replied automatically, then winced as he realized his failure. That's right, Michelle nodded. Instead, you decided to question why I was in this neighborhood. Would you like to explain your reasoning behind that decision? She watched as he shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. There have been reports of. He started, but Michelle held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Officer Davis, I write those reports. I review them every morning. There have been no recent incidents in this neighborhood. Try again. Her words hung in the air between them. The young officer's face flushed red, visible even in the dim evening light. Captain, I can explain. But again, he couldn't seem to find the right words. You know what I think? Michelle continued, her voice taking on a teaching tone she often used with new recruits. I think this is an excellent opportunity for both of us. You're going to follow me back to the station, and we're going to have a very important conversation about what just happened here. Officer Davis looked like he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole. Yes, Captain, he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. And Officer Davis, Michelle added as she prepared to start her car. On your way back, I want you to think about every assumption you made tonight. Every single one. Because tomorrow, you're going to explain each of them to the entire morning shift during briefing. The look of horror on his face almost made Michelle feel sympathy. Almost. But she knew this moment needed to be uncomfortable. Real change rarely came from comfortable situations. As Officer Davis walked back to his patrol car, his shoulders slumped in shame, Michelle took a deep breath. This wasn't about punishment or humiliation. This was about transformation. Sometimes the best lessons came from our most embarrassing mistakes. She watched in her rearview mirror as Officer Davis got back into his patrol car. The next few hours would be difficult for him, but they would also be necessary. This incident wouldn't end with just a reprimand. It would become a catalyst for change, a teaching moment that would ripple through the entire department. The police station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as Michelle led Officer Davis through the quiet hallways. The night shift officers they passed could sense something was wrong just by looking at Davis's face and Michelle's determined stride. The usual casual greetings died on their lips as the pair walked by. Inside her office, Michelle gestured for Officer Davis to take a seat while she closed the door. The young officer sank into the chair, looking much smaller than he had during the traffic stop. His eyes darted around the office, taking in the awards, certificates, and community service plaques that lined the walls. 15 years of dedicated service displayed around him. Do you know why I didn't immediately show you my badge? Michelle asked, settling into her chair behind the desk. She kept her voice level, professional, but there was an intensity that demanded honesty. Officer Davis shifted uncomfortably. To teach me a lesson. He ventured, his voice barely above a whisper. No, Michelle replied, leaning forward. I wanted to experience exactly what any other person in my position would have experienced. Someone who didn't have a badge to make you suddenly remember your training. She let that sink in for a moment before continuing. Tell me what you saw tonight when you first spotted my car. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Davis struggled to maintain eye contact. I saw an expensive car in a nice neighborhood, and he trailed off, the reality of his prejudice becoming painfully clear even to him. And you saw someone who you decided didn't belong there, Michelle finished for him. Based on nothing but a glimpse through a windshield in the dark. She opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. This contains every complaint we've received about similar stops in the last 6 months. Would you like to guess how many there are? The young officer's face paled as he stared at the folder. His hands gripped the arms of his chair so tight his knuckles turned white. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood, he said weakly. From who? Michelle's question cut through his excuse like a knife. From homeowners driving home? From community leaders attending meetings? From police captains? She opened the folder and spread out several complaint forms. Or from anyone who didn't fit your idea of who belongs in that neighborhood. Tears began to well up in Officer Davis's eyes. Not from fear of punishment, but from the crushing realization of his own bias. Michelle recognized that look. She'd seen it before in officers when the truth of their actions finally hit home. "I'm going to tell you something important," Michelle said, her tone softening slightly. "This moment right here, that shame you're feeling, don't waste it. Use it. Let it change you." She stood up and walked to a photo on her wall, a picture of her graduating class from the police academy. "When I first put on this uniform, I thought it would make everyone see me as just another officer. I was wrong. The uniform doesn't erase prejudice. Sometimes it just hides it, even from ourselves." Officer Davis wiped his eyes, trying to regain his composure. "What happens now, Captain?" he asked, his voice shaky but sincere. "Now?" Michelle sat back down, pulling out a fresh form from her desk. "Now we're going to write up exactly what happened tonight. Every detail. And tomorrow, you're going to share this story with your fellow officers." She held up her hand as he started to protest. "Not to shame you, but to help them learn from your experience." She began writing on the form. "This incident is going to become a teaching moment for the entire department. We're going to use it to create new training protocols, to show other officers how easily bias can creep into their actions, even when they don't realize it." Looking up at the still shaken officer, Michelle's expression softened slightly. "This can end one of two ways, Officer Davis. It can be the mistake that ends your career, or it can be the moment that makes you a better officer. The choice is yours." The next morning, the briefing room was packed. Word had spread quickly about the previous night's incident, and every officer who wasn't actively on patrol had squeezed into the room. The usual morning chatter died down as Michelle walked in, followed by a visibly nervous Officer Davis. The young officer stood at the front of the room, his uniform perfectly pressed, as if trying to compensate for his discomfort. His hands trembled slightly as he held the incident report he'd spent half the night writing. The silence in the room was heavy with anticipation. Before Officer Davis shares his experience, Michelle began, addressing the room. "I want every person here to understand something. This isn't about public shaming. This is about learning and growing as a department." She paused, making eye contact with several officers. "What happened last night could have happened with any one of you." Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others crossed their arms defensively. Michelle noticed every reaction, reading the room like she'd done countless times before. She nodded to Officer Davis, giving him the floor. His voice shook at first as he began to speak. "Last night, I made a traffic stop that changed how I see everything about our job." He swallowed hard, then continued, stronger. "I stopped a car because I made assumptions about who should and shouldn't be in certain neighborhoods." The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Officer Davis continued, describing every moment of the stop, every assumption he made, every mistake in procedure. As he spoke, Michelle watched the faces of the other officers. She saw recognition in some eyes, denial in others, and most importantly, understanding beginning to dawn in many. "I didn't just violate department procedure," Officer Davis said, his voice growing more confident as he shared his truth. "I violated everything we're supposed to stand for. And if Captain Chen hadn't been the one I stopped, I probably wouldn't even have realized what I'd done wrong." A hand went up in the back. "But what about crime statistics?" one officer asked. "We're supposed to be proactive in preventing crime." Michelle stepped forward. "Let's talk about those statistics," she said, pulling out a folder. "Because what they actually show might surprise you." She began sharing real data about their district. Numbers that clearly showed how biased policing had skewed their own statistics, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. As the discussion continued, more officers began to speak up. Some shared their own experiences of being profiled when off duty. Others admitted to similar assumptions they'd made during stops. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was necessary. "Starting today," Michelle announced, "we're implementing new protocols for traffic stops." She outlined the changes, mandatory documentation of reason for stops before initiation, regular review of stop patterns, and most importantly, a new training program focused on recognizing and overcoming implicit bias. Officer Davis stood straighter as he listened. The shame in his eyes had been replaced by something else: determination. "I've asked Captain Chen if I can help develop the training program," he said. "I want to use my mistake to help others avoid making the same one." The announcement caused a stir in the room. This wasn't the usual punishment they expected. This was something different, a chance for real change, starting from within. As the meeting wound down, officers began approaching Officer Davis, sharing their own stories, asking questions. The atmosphere had shifted from tension to something more hopeful. Michelle watched from the side, seeing the exact kind of transformation she'd hoped for. A senior officer approached her. "You know," he said quietly, "this could have gone very differently. You could have had his badge." Michelle nodded. And nothing would have changed except one less officer on the force. Sometimes, the hardest lessons make the best teachers. 1 month after the incident, Michelle sat in her office reviewing the latest statistics. The changes were already showing promising results. Traffic stop complaints had dropped by 30%, while community engagement had increased significantly. But numbers only told part of the story. Through her office window, she could see Officer Davis in the parking lot, talking with a group of community members. He had transformed from someone who viewed certain neighborhoods with suspicion to an officer who knew residents by name. The training program they developed together was making waves beyond their own department. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. The chief of police entered, holding a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" he asked, laying it on her desk. The headline read, "Local Police Department Leads the Way in Reform." The article detailed how their new training program was being adopted by other districts. "The State Police Academy called this morning," the chief continued, sitting down across from her. "They want you and Officer Davis to present your program to their next class. They're saying this could change how we train officers across the state." Michelle picked up the newspaper, remembering that night 1 month ago. "You know what's interesting?" she said. "If Officer Davis hadn't stopped me that night, none of this would have happened." The chief nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes. Speaking of changes," he pulled out a folder. "The Community Oversight Board reviewed your proposal for the new Neighborhood Engagement Program." She opened the folder to find the approval forms already signed. The program would pair officers with local community leaders, requiring them to spend time getting to know the neighborhoods they patrolled, not just the streets and buildings, but the people who lived there. Later that afternoon, Michelle watched from the back of the training room as Officer Davis led a session with new recruits. His voice was confident now, passionate about the message he was sharing. "Being a good officer isn't just about knowing the law," he told the fresh-faced recruits. "It's about knowing your community. It's about checking your assumptions at the door and seeing people as people, not statistics." One recruit raised her hand. "But how do you know when you're making assumptions? Sometimes they're so automatic you don't even realize you're making them." Officer Davis smiled. "That's exactly the right question," he said, then shared the story of that night, not holding back any details. The recruits listened intently as he described how his own biases had nearly derailed his career, and how facing those biases had made him a better officer. Michelle slipped out quietly, walking through the station hallways. Officers greeted her warmly as she passed, many stopping to share updates about their community engagement efforts. The atmosphere in the department had shifted noticeably over the past month. Outside, she ran into Mrs. Thompson, the community council president, who was arriving for their weekly meeting. "Captain," the elderly woman smiled warmly, "I was just telling my grandson of the changes in the department. He's thinking about becoming an officer now. Says he wants to be part of what you're building here." Michelle felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was why she'd chosen this path all those years ago. Not just to wear the badge, but to make real change. That difficult night had opened doors she never expected, creating ripples that were still spreading. Back in her office, she found an email from a police department in another state, asking about implementing their training program. As she began to reply, she could hear Officer Davis in the distance, still teaching his class. His voice carried down the hallway, clear and determined. Every interaction is a chance to build trust. Every moment is an opportunity to learn and grow. Michelle smiled as she typed. Sometimes, the best changes came from the hardest moments. What could have been just another story of bias and confrontation had become something much more powerful. A catalyst for real transformation. 6 months after that fateful traffic stop, the department's community center was packed for a special ceremony. The room buzzed with energy as officers mingled with community members, local leaders, and police officials from neighboring districts. What had started as one difficult encounter had grown into something much bigger. Officer Davis stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd. His hands no longer shook when he spoke in public. Instead, he carried himself with quiet confidence. When I started this job, he began, I thought I knew what good policing meant. I was wrong. Good policing isn't about power or control. It's about understanding and serving our community. In the audience, Michelle watched proudly as he shared the department's journey over the past 6 months. The changes they'd implemented had caught the attention of police departments across the country. Their training program had been adopted by 12 other districts, and the results were speaking for themselves. A local business owner raised his hand during the Q&A session. I've lived here for 30 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This is the first time I felt comfortable walking into a police station. My grandkids now wave at officers instead of hiding from them. How did you make such a big change so quickly? Officer Davis looked at Michelle before answering. It started with one person brave enough to turn a bad situation into a teaching moment, he said. And then it spread because every officer in this department was willing to look in the mirror and be honest about what they saw. The next speaker was a young officer from another district who had gone through their training program. Before this program, she shared, I didn't realize how many assumptions I was making every day. Now, I see people first, not stereotypes. My arrest numbers are down, but my positive community interactions have tripled. During the break, Michelle overheard conversations that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Officers were chatting with local teens about basketball and college plans. Community leaders were sharing family stories with rookie officers. The invisible wall between police and community was crumbling, one relationship at a time. A state senator who had attended the ceremony approached Michelle. We're looking to make your training program mandatory for all departments in the state, she said. Would you be willing to testify before the state legislature about its impact? As Michelle agreed, she noticed Officer Davis across the room, showing a group of young officers the data from their first 6 months. The numbers were impressive. Complaints down 60%, community trust ratings up significantly, and improved response times because people were more willing to cooperate with officers they trusted. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned out, an elderly gentleman approached Michelle. My son was stopped by your officers last week, he said, and Michelle felt her heart skip a beat. But then he smiled. The officer was so professional, so respectful. He explained everything he was doing and why. When I was young, that kind of interaction was unimaginable. Michelle watched as Officer Davis helped stack chairs after the ceremony. He was chatting with a group of teenage volunteers, laughing at their jokes, treating them with the natural respect that had been missing from their first encounter 6 months ago. You know what the best part is? Officer Davis said as they locked up the community center. Now when I patrol those same streets where I stopped you, I don't see strangers who don't belong. I see Mrs. Wilson walking her dog, Mr. Lee coming home from his restaurant, kids I know by name playing basketball. I see my community. Michelle nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest moments: a traffic stop, a difficult conversation, a willingness to learn and grow. They had turned a potentially negative story into one of hope and transformation, proving that real change was possible when people were brave enough to face their own biases and do the hard work of becoming better. 1 year after that life-changing traffic stop, Michelle stood in front of a packed auditorium at the National Police Chiefs Conference. Behind her, a large screen showed photos of community events, training sessions, and officers interacting with residents. The audience included police leaders from across the country, all eager to learn about the program that had made national headlines. "Change doesn't always come from grand gestures," she began, her voice carrying through the silent room. "Sometimes it starts with one difficult moment, one honest conversation, one person willing to learn from their mistakes." She clicked to the next slide, showing Officer Davis teaching a group of new recruits. "A year ago, if you had told me that a biased traffic stop would lead to one of the most successful police reform programs in the country, I wouldn't have believed you," she continued. "But here we are. Our department's story has become a blueprint for change." The statistics spoke for themselves. Complaints against officers had dropped by 70%. Community trust ratings had reached historic highs. Crime rates had decreased, not because of aggressive policing, but because residents now saw officers as partners in keeping their neighborhoods safe. From the front row, Officer Davis watched with pride. He had just been promoted to training sergeant, responsible for implementing the program he had helped create. The young officer who had made that fateful traffic stop was now teaching others how to overcome their own biases. "But numbers only tell part of the story," Michelle said, switching to a slide showing children playing basketball with officers. "The real change is in the daily interactions. It's in the teenager who waves at patrol cars instead of running away. It's in the grandmother who brings cookies to the precinct. It's in the officer who knows every shop owner on their beat by name." A police chief from Texas raised his hand. "This all sounds great, but how do you maintain it? How do you make sure officers don't slip back into old habits?" Michelle smiled. "That's where the real work begins. We didn't just create a training program. We changed our entire culture. Every officer is now part of our community engagement team. They spend time in neighborhoods when there isn't a crisis. They coach youth sports teams. They attend community events. They become part of the fabric of the community they serve." She clicked to a new slide showing their latest initiative, a mentorship program pairing officers with local high school students interested in law enforcement careers. The cycle of positive change continues. These students will become the next generation of officers, already understanding the importance of community connection. After her presentation, a line of police chiefs waited to speak with her. But Michelle's attention was drawn to a conversation happening near the stage. Officer Davis was showing a group of young officers photos on his phone, pictures of him playing chess with elderly residents in the park, helping kids with homework at the community center, sharing meals with families during neighborhood gatherings. The best part, she overheard him say, "I don't have to pretend. This isn't just community policing strategy anymore. These people are my friends, my neighbors, my community." Later that evening, as Michelle packed up her presentation materials, a veteran police chief approached her. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been in law enforcement for 30 years. I've seen a lot of programs come and go. But this is different. You're not just changing procedures, you're changing hearts." On the drive home, Michelle reflected on the past year. That tense traffic stop could have ended so differently, with anger, punishment, and nothing really changing. Instead, it had become a catalyst for transformation, not just in their department, but across the country. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed Officer Davis' patrol car parked down the street. He was sitting on a porch, sharing coffee with an elderly couple, laughing at their stories. This was what real community policing looked like, not us versus them, but simply people connecting with people. The story that had started with bias and tension had transformed into something beautiful, a reminder that change was possible, that growth could come from the most difficult moments, and that sometimes the best endings start with the courage to face our mistakes and learn from them.